Hello, I'm Esther Gidhu Yuat. It's Tuesday, September 20th. This is Africa 54.
U.S. President Joe Biden prepares to address the United Nations General Assembly Wednesday, and strengthening global food security is high on his agenda. VOA's Peter Claudy talks with the president of the African Export-Import Bank in a wide-ranging interview that includes a discussion on correcting the imbalance of food supplies across the continent. And Britain's Queen Elizabeth is laid to rest following a funeral services attended by world leaders and watched by millions of people worldwide on television. All this and much more on today's Africa 54.
U.S. President Joe Biden is poised to address the UN General Assembly in New York Wednesday. He is expected to highlight U.S. efforts to strengthen global security and replenish the global fund to fight AIDS and other pandemics. VOA White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara reports.
Some 828 million people go to bed hungry every night, according to the World Food Program, making global food security a priority for leaders gathering at the UN General Assembly beginning Tuesday. President Joe Biden will address the Assembly on Wednesday.
He'll have a chance to address the whole General Assembly in the morning. He'll be dealing with issues of food security around the globe, food security which is exacerbated by the war in Ukraine.
Biden will seek to balance U.S. and European allies' interest of supporting Ukraine and isolating Russia with the myriad problems faced by the rest of the world.
Early in the war, European diplomats in particular demanded that their African and Asian counterparts should support Ukraine at the UN. But they didn't really show that they were listening to their counterparts' concerns about food security and the economic shocks linked to this war. Now the US and the Europeans are really trying to send the message that they are sympathetic to the developing world's economic concerns and that they will work to address those concerns.
To that end, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will co-host a food security summit on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly Tuesday. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, exports of food and fertilizer from the region have been disrupted. This pushed post-pandemic food prices even higher and the world further from achieving the UN goal of zero hunger by 2030.
We need to invest a lot more in agriculture and food systems, or particularly change things around in food systems such that they become more inclusive so the poor people can reap more benefits from it, that food prices stay low so that they're accessible, and that production becomes more resilient and sustainable.
Global health is another priority for the administration.
Because, as COVID-19 reminded us, global health threats do not respect borders. We must tackle COVID-19, monkeypox, and other outbreaks, and we must do it together.
Also Wednesday, Biden will host a conference on the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. The U.S. has given $2 billion out of the $6 billion committed to meet the $18 billion needed globally. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Washington.
The president of African Export-Import Bank says Africa should move away from food aid toward sustainable food production on the continent. Benedict Orama says a partnership between Africa and its international partners will help strengthen local agriculture and encourage subsistence farmers to develop agricultural businesses that can improve their lives. Orama tells VOA's Peter Claudy that cooperation between Africa and its international partners can also help correct the imbalance of food surplus and food shortages across Africa.
The problem with food aid is that it creates dependence. I'm not saying that when we are in dire need that people can't come to help, but we should rejig the way we do that so that in that process we build a foundation to make sure that we say never again. We don't have to rush to help again. So the way it's done today, although it's beginning to change, is that when we have famine, we have extreme hunger, crisis, donors rush food from all over the world, but they do not get it from Africa. So what that has then done is that people give the food they have. Those who are donating give what they have. And over time, our tastes have changed. What it then means is that we've developed a taste to eat the cheap food that has been donated. So we are no longer cultivating ours, what we normally eat. So it has created huge import dependence. So when we don't have money to pay for the imports, we go hungry again. Not because we cannot produce, but because our tastes have changed and we are import dependent and we are not able to generate the foreign exchange to continue to import those things. So we have recurrent food.
So, Dr. Orama, what specific steps do you think African countries can take to reverse this or correct this?
It doesn't have to be only African countries. It has to. That's why I gave you this background I gave earlier. It also has to go global, all the donor community and the African countries. Africa is a huge continent. As a matter of fact, as you talk about food famine here, in other parts of Africa there's surplus. The problem is that we're not moving those surplus from other parts of Africa to where you have scarcity, as will happen normally in a country. So what we are saying is, first, to stimulate overall food production on the continent, the donor community, if there's a food crisis in one part of Africa, they should try to supply that part from other parts of Africa where you have surplus, before you start going out if you don't have enough. The second thing is that the demand created by the donor community and also ourselves should be enough to also stimulate production of food in many parts of Africa. What we've done, and we and WF World Food Program have done something unique in this area. In July, we entered in a memorandum of understanding ourselves, Afrexim Bank, WFP, and African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. That MOU is in an amount of $2 billion. So we are doing, jointly with WFP, a blended financing to enable us to provide funding to small growers in Africa and commodity traders to make it possible for WFP to then buy from them to supply parts of Africa where we have food problem using AFCFTA rules and protocols.
Visit voaafrica.com to watch Peter Clotty's full interview with Benedict Orama. Turning to the Horn of Africa now, in Ethiopia's Tigray region, where troops from neighboring Eritrea have reportedly launched a major offensive on Tuesday, and heavy fighting is ongoing along the border. This information has not yet been confirmed by VOA. If confirmed, the offensive would mark an escalation in a war that has already displaced millions and triggered a humanitarian disaster across northern Ethiopia. The Horn of Africa nation is on the brink of a second famine in just over a decade, enduring its worst drought in 40 years after failed rainy seasons since late 2020 wiped out crops and livestock. With a fifth monsoon forecast to fail, the UN is warning that time is running out to save lives, and it's urging donors to contribute more to the relief effort. The UN humanitarian chief Martin Griffiths says the situation is worse than the 2011 famine when 260,000 people died in Somalia. The spokesman for South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa says he is returning home from Britain to tackle the nation's power crisis instead of heading to the UNGA. Struggling utility Eskom has implemented major electricity cuts. David Doyle reports.
South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa will miss a United Nations General Assembly this week, his spokesman has said. so that he can tackle a national power crisis. Vincent Magwenya told South African media that Ramaphosa, in the UK on Monday for the funeral of Queen Elizabeth, had been scheduled to travel to New York, but had decided to cancel. That's after South Africa's state-owned power utility Eskom moved to stage 6 electricity outages on Sunday. It's only the third time it has ever taken the measure, which deprives most South Africans of power for at least 6 hours a day. Eskom has implemented outages for over a decade, choking economic growth in Africa's most industrialized country. Amid growing public anger, Ramaphosa pledged new steps to address the crisis in July. However, power cuts have persisted. Magwenya said Ramaphosa wanted to better understand what had led to a large number of recent breakdowns at Eskom's fleet of aging coal-fired power plants. He also wants to know what progress has been made on the interventions he announced in July.
David Doyle of Reuters filed that report. Britain's Queen Elizabeth II was laid to rest Monday following a funeral service attended by world leaders and watched by millions on television. Henry Ridgwell reports from London.
A queen adored by her people, a monarch who commanded respect and fascination far beyond Britain's shores. Elizabeth's coffin was carried on a gun carriage pulled by Royal Navy personnel to Westminster Abbey, the towering stage for a millennium of royal history. 2,000 mourners attended the funeral, including over 100 presidents and 20 monarchs. US President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden were among the congregation. A royal line of succession followed the coffin. First, led by King Charles III, the Queen's 4 children. Then the next generations, William and Catherine, and 2 of their young children, George and Charlotte, and Harry and Meghan. Queen Elizabeth, a monarch of deep Christian faith, had made detailed plans for her funeral and had chosen her favourite hymns and lessons.
Let us commend to the mercy of God, our Maker and Redeemer, the soul of Elizabeth, our late Queen.
The Queen's piper played a traditional lament, Sleep, Dearie, Sleep, that faded to silence. Millions of people across Britain watched the service on big screens in parks and movie theatres.
I was compelled to come here. It's a great moment in time for the world to come together, a time of unity.
We are here to, say final goodbye to our mother of our nation, and we are deeply saddened on this occasion.
We're together with the nation to celebrate the Queen and the time that, just the time that she's had on the throne. We're going to miss her a lot, actually.
Some mourners say they felt a deep personal connection with the Queen, that they have lost someone they loved. For others, it is a mark of respect for a monarch who served her country for 7 decades. For all, to be here is to be part of history, a day no one will forget. After the service, the coffin was taken through central London and transferred to the state hearse for the journey to Windsor Castle. The final procession was again on foot, along Windsor's 3-mile-long walk, waiting to welcome her home, the Queen's beloved corgis. The coffin was taken into St George's Chapel for the committal service. The imperial state crown, the sceptre and orb, the symbols of royal succession, were removed from the coffin and placed on the altar. A final farewell from son to mother. The coffin was lowered into the royal vault.
Go forth upon thy journey from this world, O Christian soul, in the name of God the Father Almighty, who created thee.
A family's private grief played out in the public eye, steered by centuries of tradition. And so one era ends and a new one begins. For Britain, it has been a long painful goodbye for a dearly loved Queen. Henry Ridgewell for VOA News, London.
Still to come in our health report, tracking germs that spread between animals and people. But first, Heidi Adams tells us what's on tap for Wednesday's Straight Talk Africa.
Join me, Heidi Adams, as we bring you Straight Talk Africa from New York to discuss this year's United Nations General Assembly. Leaders from all over the world convene to tackle the critical issues of our time. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has worsened the global food crisis, and it's triggering fears of a potential nuclear accident. Where do African leaders stand, and what are their priorities? We'll have expert analysis for you on the next Straight Talk Africa.
Uganda's health ministry on Tuesday announced the country's first fatality from the highly contagious Ebola virus since 2019, declaring an outbreak in the central district of Mubende. Nigeria's National Drug Law Enforcement Agency says a record 1.8 tons of cocaine was seized from a warehouse in Lagos with a street value of $278 million. And Equatorial Guinea has abolished the death penalty 8 years after the last executions took place. And for more on health, we are now joined by our health correspondent, Lino Mudu. Hello, Lino.
Hello, Esther. Monkeypox and COVID-19 are raising awareness around the world of zoonotic diseases that are passed between animals and human beings. The Ugandan government has built a laboratory that tracks zoonotic diseases in national parks, where many communities live close to a wide variety of wildlife. Take a look. Inside the park at Mweya is this newly commissioned Uganda Wildlife Authority Diagnostics and Research Laboratory. The first of its kind in the region, the facility monitors incidents and acts as an early warning system for the transference of zoonotic infections. Sam Wanda is the executive director of the Uganda Wildlife Authority.
Our ability to actually pick samples and test samples for diseases was limited. Very often, if we were not able to get support from the UVRI, the Uganda Virus Research Institute in Entebbe, we would have to ship these samples abroad to be able to determine what disease we have. So working with our partners from the US called DITRA, they offered to help us construct a biosafety level 2 laboratory that is constructed in Mweya. That laboratory is now operational.
The outbreaks of COVID-19 and monkeypox have raised concern among scientists about the recurrence of zoonotic diseases that are passed between animals and humans. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says more than half of all human infections, such as malaria, Ebola, and SARS, are zoonotic in origin. The new laboratory tracks zoonotic diseases in national parks, where many communities live close to a wide variety of wildlife.
So the capability of this lab is currently in 3 forms. 1, we can do diagnosis. 2, we can do forensics. We are developing a pipeline for forensics, especially for wildlife, and then we do research. And when we do research in bacterial pathogens, protozoan pathogens. We do research in viral pathogens as well.
The laboratory has been busy since opening its doors a few months ago.
The burden in wildlife tends to cascade to the livestock and then cascades to the human beings. Like for example, a tourist died due to Marburg in Python Cave. So we are doing a study to follow up on those bats to see how far do they move from the cave to the villages, so that we can sensitize those people that these bats, despite them coming to your village, they are carrying a given disease that might be detrimental to your health.
Experts say as growing populations spill over onto previously undisturbed areas of wildlife, the risk of transmission of infections between animals and humans increases. They say 3 out of every 4 new or emerging infectious diseases in people come from animals. The World Health Organization reports that cases of monkeypox worldwide has fallen in recent weeks by more than 25%. However, over 45,000 people have been infected with monkeypox in nearly 100 countries. But Africa has not yet received a supply of monkeypox vaccine. I spoke with Dr. Dimi Ogoina. He's a professor of medicine and infectious diseases at Niger Delta University about the situation.
The fact that we still have many unknowns about monkeypox is because it was never a problem for the global north, where they have the resources, the know-how, the investment that is required to uncover the gaps and the knowledge gaps associated with monkeypox. It seems that the concept of global solidarity is only in words, but it doesn't reflect in our action. And I always say that the recognition of infectious diseases as the conditions that have no borders, we may assume that because vaccines are available to certain countries or certain regions in the world, that we are protected. But if we neglect the African countries, these pathogens will come back to haunt us. And that's why it is said that the world is a global village. We also need to look at research, addressing the knowledge gaps. Because if we continue this way, and we don't invest in research and development for Africa, for instance, it means that solutions that will be developed will only address the problem for developed countries and not for developing countries. I think the first priority is for us to ensure that we're ready. How is the health system ready to get these vaccines, to distribute them, to store them? What are the issues of vaccine hesitancy? The time we made that observation in 2017, nobody would have ever thought that monkeypox would be transmitted via sexual contact. The traditional knowledge there was that monkeypox was transmitted via animals, and household contacts were predisposed from respiratory droplets. And in that meeting, when I made that presentation and said there's a chance that monkeypox will be transmitted via sexual contact, it was a scientific gathering, and I was opposed. And I was opposed on the basis of the fact that it was not previously known to be transmitted by sexual contact. That was one. Secondly, the information we gave was that because we had high rates of genital ulcers, we were suspecting sexual contact. And the people at the other side felt that genital ulcers or genital rash were also common before now, even from animal exposure. So that's not a good reason to attribute it to sexual contact. The third reason that they had a different view was that we only reported in a few patients, because at the time we made this report, we had just about 21 patients or so in my center. This is an area that we need to explore further. We should not wait for the developed world to bring solutions to us, to bring interventions. So we must take up our responsibility and ensure that we do what is needed to address our problems. And the second thing I want to highlight here is that monkeypox is largely a self-limiting illness. It's not likely to kill, except for some patients that have HIV infection, are not taking medication, have significant immunosuppression for some other reasons. They are at risk of having severe disease that may result in death. So we should not be alarmed. We should not panic. We should not spread falsehood.
And that's today's health report. Esther, back to you.
Thanks, Lino. Be sure to watch Lino Mudu's health reports every Tuesday right here on Africa 54. A United Nations report states that nearly 244 million children and young people are out of school. COVID-19 is exposing the fault lines of education system worldwide. The pandemic has harmed the learning of more than 90% of the world's children, the most significant disruption in history, with half of all countries cutting their education budgets, further deepening the crisis. Paul Ndiho has more.
The Transforming Education Summit kicked off recently at UN headquarters in New York, with Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, receiving the first ever Youth Declaration on Transforming Education Award, the result of the participation of almost 500,000 children and young people from 170 countries. Guterres says that education is very important.
If I had to choose one single thing in which to invest for peace and security, I would say education. If there was one single thing in which we should invest to reduce the dramatic inequalities in the world, I would say education.
The Education Summit provides a unique opportunity to elevate education to the top of the global political agenda and sow the seeds to transform education.
Today we are also marking the culmination of the youth-led process to gather the demand, vision and commitments for transforming education, leading to the first ever Youth Declaration on Transforming Education.
Jeremiah Thoronko, a Sierra Leonean student, invented a device that uses kinetic energy from traffic and pedestrians to generate clean power and was the recipient of the Global Student Prize 2021.
I have used every concept and skill I have learned in the classroom to build something great that benefits my community, my country, and Africa's strive to become climate resilient. This all may sound extraordinary, but all of us in this room can become innovators if only access to quality education is made accessible to wherever we find ourselves around the world.
The UN estimates that 64% of children worldwide cannot read or write or understand a simple story, and that 840 million young people will leave school in their teens with no qualification or skills for the future workplace.
If a girl completes secondary education, never mind if the quality isn't even there yet, as it should be there. Never mind if it's just being in the four walls of a classroom up to the end of secondary school, that risk of infection reduces by 50%. Pandemic is more than health. As you can see, it's education.
As world leaders gather in New York to address education challenges worldwide, some schools in Ivory Coast are taking harsh measures and vow to expel, quote, losers to boost grades, a move that is seen by many as controversial. The measure is an old one brought back by authorities in the hope of raising the general standards of education in the West African country, prohibiting any pupil with an acceptable grade from pursuing their studies. But proponents say this is the only way to boost quality education in the country. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.